Ancient Mesopotamians believed epilepsy was possession by evil spirits. In the shadowed cradle of civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved life into the earth, ancient Mesopotamians looked up at the stars and down into the soul with equal awe and fear. They were among the first to write, to count, to dream in stone. But in their temples and homes, in the murmur of priests and the whispers of the sick, there existed a fear older than language itself, a condition that seized the body without warning, twisted limbs, silenced breath, and left behind no visible wound. To them, it was not a sickness of the flesh, it was a sign of possession. Epilepsy, in the ancient Mesopotamian mind, was not a neurological disorder. It was a message from the spirit world, a curse from the unseen. The Babylonians had no MRI machines, no EEGs, but they had clay, and into that clay they etched their truth. When a man fell and foamed at the mouth, when his eyes rolled back and his muscles tensed like drawn bowstrings, it meant one thing: he had been touched by a demon. We know this because archaeologists unearthed dozens of cuneiform tablets from sites like Nineveh and Ashurbanipal's library, dating as far back as 2000 BCE. These tablets were inscribed with diagnostic texts and prescriptions, not in the language of medicine, but in the language of magic. One such tablet describes a man whose body convulses, his eyes stare, his limbs jerk. He has been seized by the ghost of a dead man. Another blames a specific evil spirit called a seizure, which enters through the ear and causes violent attacks. To suffer from epilepsy was to be claimed by something beyond the veil of the living. The diagnosis was spiritual, and so too was the cure. Treatment came not from healers in the modern sense, but from a specialized class of priests called asipu, exorcists trained to identify the nature of the possessing entity and expel it through elaborate rituals. Incantations were whispered over oil and incense. Sacred symbols were drawn in ash. Amulets were tied to the wrists and ankles of the afflicted. And in the heart of the night, as the stars wheeled silently above, the priest would chant, "Out with you, spirit of the grave, who binds this man! Out with you, serpent of the underworld, who crushes his breath!" This wasn't superstition in the casual sense. It was theology. The Mesopotamian cosmos was not indifferent. It was teeming with forces, both divine and malevolent. Gods like Ea and Shamash could heal, but it was the demons, the Utuku, the Rabisu, the Giddim, who lurked in the shadows, waiting to slip inside a body left unguarded. Illness in this worldview wasn't random. It was relational. If you were sick, it was because some spirit had taken offense, or some ritual had gone undone. It's easy to dismiss these ideas today with our knowledge of the brain's electrical storms. But pause. Consider what it meant to live in a world where no physical injury explained the shaking, no wound justified the collapse. When a child dropped lifeless in the dirt, when a warrior convulsed before battle, what could you believe, except that something unseen had reached into your world and grabbed them? And there's a haunting precision in these ancient texts. Babylonian scribes categorized epilepsy by type: nocturnal seizures, attacks involving screaming, convulsions triggered by specific times of day. They didn't understand neurons, but they observed patterns. One text even warns of a seizure disorder that could be fatal if the spirit isn't banished in time. In this way, their cosmology and our biology began at the same point: human experience. Yet the treatments, as foreign as they seem, were not without a strange power. Rituals created order. Incantations gave the sufferer a story, a way to fight back against something terrifying. The Asipu's presence gave families hope, and for many, the belief that a spirit could be cast out was more comforting than the modern knowledge that no cure exists. Some historians argue that these practices laid the groundwork for later religious traditions. The notion of demons possessing the body and priests conducting exorcisms echoes across the centuries, from ancient Babylon to the deserts of Judea to medieval Europe. What began in clay carried through scroll, scripture, and smoke. But not all Mesopotamian healers were priests. There were also ASU, practical doctors who relied more on herbs and ointments than on chants. They sometimes treated epilepsy as a physical imbalance, a disturbance of the body's humors. This dual system, spiritual and physical, foreshadows our own medical tensions. Even today, debates continue between science and spirituality, diagnosis and belief. In the end, perhaps the most chilling truth is not how wrong the Babylonians were, but how closely they clung to meaning. In their view, epilepsy wasn't meaningless chaos. It was a battle, a punishment, a warning. To be seized was to be seen by powers greater than yourself. And in a world without antiseptics, without neurology, without explanation, perhaps that belief was its own kind of healing. Today, we know epilepsy arises from misfiring neurons, from genetic mutations, from physical trauma or infections. We name the seizures, classify them, medicate them. But still, those who suffer speak of a loss of control, of vanishing time, of terror that cannot be named. The language has changed. The mystery, not entirely. The clay tablets remain, cracked and ancient, etched by hands long turned to dust. They do not offer cures, but they whisper something older than medicine, that to suffer is to be noticed, and that in the eyes of the ancient world, the body was never alone. It was a battleground for the invisible, and that, somehow, still resonates. Hippocrates challenged the sacred disease myth in 400 BCE and was ignored for centuries. In the year 400 BCE, on the sun-baked coast of the Aegean Sea, a physician named Hippocrates dared to defy the gods, not by sword or rebellion, but by questioning one of the most sacred beliefs of his time. To the ancient Greeks, epilepsy was no ordinary affliction. It was known as the sacred disease, a divine punishment, a spiritual curse, or an omen delivered by the gods themselves. When a person convulsed in the dust, eyes rolled back, limbs stiff and jerking, the bystanders saw not a body in crisis, but a soul caught in the grasp of otherworldly forces. This belief was not isolated. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and even into India and China, epilepsy carried the shadow of the supernatural. Possession, divine wrath, ancestral vengeance. Every seizure was treated with ritual, exorcism, prayer, and sacrifice. The ailment belonged to priests and mystics, not doctors. But Hippocrates saw something else, something that would not be understood or accepted for another 2,000 years. Hippocrates, the so-called father of Western medicine, was no stranger to heresy. He was born on the island of Kos, trained in the tradition of Asclepius the healer, yet committed to a radical idea, that diseases came from nature, not the gods. He believed the body, not the heavens, held the secrets to illness. And epilepsy, he argued, was not sacred at all. In fact, it was simply a disorder of the brain. In his treatise on the sacred disease, Hippocrates wrote, "It is my opinion that this disease is no wise, more divine nor more sacred than other diseases, but has a natural cause from the originating from the brain." These words were incendiary. To claim that something so spiritually charged could be reduced to malfunctioning flesh was to cut directly into the religious core of ancient belief. He went further, observing that the brain controlled not only thought and movement, but emotion, personality, and consciousness itself. If the brain was disturbed, then so too was the person. He noted patterns in the afflicted, the times of day, the changes in weather, even the stages of life. He watched, recorded, and rejected supernatural explanations in favor of physical ones. His writings were a quiet revolution, clear, reasoned, and centuries ahead of their time. But the world wasn't ready. For the next 2 millennia, Hippocrates' voice was silenced, not by force, but by tradition. Christianity later folded epilepsy into its own theological framework, declaring seizures to be evidence of demonic possession. The possessed were beaten, burned, exorcised. Those who suffered were often imprisoned or isolated, labeled dangerous or cursed. In some cases, they were revered as visionaries, touched by the divine. But more often, they were feared. Medical science, such as it was during the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages, preserved the name of Hippocrates, but not always his method. Physicians invoked his authority while ignoring his radical claim that epilepsy was a physical disease. His notion of the brain as the seat of all thought and behavior was lost in a sea of mysticism, humoral theory, and ecclesiastical control, and so for centuries the sacred disease remained sacred, immune to inquiry, shrouded in taboo. It wasn't until the Enlightenment, when the candlelight of reason began flickering against the shadows of dogma, that Hippocrates' ideas were unearthed again. In the 1600s and 1700s, scientists began to observe the brain more carefully. Dissections, electricity, neural pathways. Slowly, the pieces fell into place. But it wasn't until the 19th century, over 2,200 years after Hippocrates first wrote those words, that the modern medical field officially acknowledged epilepsy as a neurological disorder. In 1861, John Hewlings Jackson, a British neurologist, began to describe epilepsy in terms of cortical activity, mapping seizures to specific regions of the brain. His work confirmed what Hippocrates had claimed millennia earlier. The sacred veil was finally lifted. The disease, once feared as divine punishment, could now be diagnosed, studied, and eventually treated. But the journey was not just medical, it was deeply human. In revealing epilepsy as a brain disorder, Hippocrates offered more than knowledge. He offered dignity. He challenged the idea that sufferers were cursed or possessed, and instead framed them as patients, people whose suffering had a cause, and perhaps, one day, a cure. It is easy to forget how dangerous such an idea once was. To name a sacred curse as a symptom of biology was to chip away at the structure of belief that governed life and death. In doing so, Hippocrates laid the groundwork not only for neurology, but for the very notion that illness need not be shameful. Today, epilepsy affects millions. Treatments exist, research continues, but the ghosts of stigma remain. In many parts of the world, the old beliefs still linger: fear, isolation, whispers of the supernatural. And so, the legacy of Hippocrates is not complete. His words, ignored for centuries, still carry a quiet urgency. He was right. The brain, not the gods, holds the key. But understanding is not just a matter of science. It is a matter of history, of culture, of courage. And sometimes it takes centuries for the truth to be heard. Hippocrates spoke that truth in a time when it could not be accepted. He peered through the curtain of myth and saw the machinery of the mind. He believed that nature, not divinity, governed disease. And while the world did not listen then, we listen now, not just to understand the illness, but to honor the insight that once stood alone against the gods. This is more than medical history. It's a reminder that truth often arrives early and waits patiently for the world to catch up. In medieval Europe, seizures were seen as proof of sin or satanic possession. In the shadowed cathedrals and torchlit villages of medieval Europe, a terrifying misunderstanding gripped the minds of the people. When a person suddenly fell to the ground, convulsing violently, eyes rolled back and limbs thrashing, it was not seen as a medical crisis. It was seen as a sign of spiritual defilement. To the average villager, or even to clergy of the time, seizures were not physical. They were moral. They were metaphysical. They were, above all else, proof that the person was under the influence of the devil. Epilepsy, as we understand it today, did not exist in the minds of medieval Europeans. There was no concept of neurological misfiring or abnormal brain activity. Instead, these fits were viewed through the lens of sin and salvation. The afflicted were believed to be paying the price for personal wickedness or cursed bloodlines. Worse, they were often thought to be possessed, literally inhabited, by demons. And so the treatments were not scientific. They were spiritual and often brutal. Imagine being a child in the 13th century, growing up in a village where every cough, twitch, or misstep might be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. Now imagine that child collapsing during a harvest festival, body jerking uncontrollably in front of the entire congregation. The villagers freeze. A woman screams. The priest steps forward, clutching his crucifix tightly, already chanting the words of exorcism. That child is not rushed to a healer. He is not offered comfort. He is isolated, bound, and subjected to a ritual meant to drive out the devil. The Church wielded enormous influence over public perception. Canon law, sermons, and theological texts often spoke of possession and divine punishment. St. Augustine himself speculated that illness could be the result of sin. Epileptics were frequently brought before clergy instead of doctors. The afflicted might be chained during a seizure. They might be forced to fast, confess imaginary sins, or endure public exorcisms. In extreme cases, they were even subjected to physical abuse under the guise of spiritual cleansing, beaten, burned, or branded in hopes of purifying the soul. Monasteries often acted as asylums, housing the mad and possessed, including those with epilepsy. But even here, sanctuary was tainted by superstition. Sufferers were kept in isolation, denied basic compassion, or forced into endless prayer and penance. And outside the cloister walls, stigma ran deep. Families disowned epileptics, communities feared them. Marriage, inheritance, and even burial rites were denied. To have epilepsy was not merely to be ill, it was to be marked. What made this fear so pervasive was how little was understood about the human body. Medicine at the time was dominated by Galenic theories of humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Any imbalance was treated with purging, bloodletting, or herbal concoctions. But seizures did not neatly fit this model. They struck without warning, seemed to defy nature, and left no physical trace once over. They were terrifying to witness and impossible to predict. So the mind turned to what it could comprehend, the eternal battle between good and evil. Even the word epilepsy carried spiritual connotations, derived from the Greek epilepsia, meaning to seize or to take hold of. It was often interpreted as a force acting upon the body. In medieval theology, that force was demonic. Medical texts from the period, like those of Hildegard of Bingen or Bartholomeus Anglicus, tried to walk the line between spiritual and natural causes, but always left room for the devil's hand. The public spectacle of exorcism only reinforced the cycle. When a seizure occurred and an exorcism was performed, the sheer drama of the moment, the incantations, the screams, the eventual stillness, seemed like proof of efficacy. The fact that seizures often ended on their own made it appear that the ritual had succeeded. Thus, belief fed upon itself. Women with epilepsy fared even worse. In a society already suspicious of feminine power and independence, women who suffered seizures were more likely to be accused of witchcraft. Their convulsions, hallucinations, or sudden outbursts could be interpreted as proof of communion with Satan. The Malleus Maleficarum, that infamous witch-hunting manual of the late 15th century, encouraged inquisitors to see any unexplained behavior as evidence of a pact with the devil. For epileptic women, this often ended at the stake. There were glimmers of hope, brief moments when ancient knowledge tried to rise again. Some early physicians, particularly in the Arab world and in rare intellectual circles within Europe, attempted to reframe epilepsy as a disease of the brain. These ideas drew from Hippocrates, who centuries earlier had declared epilepsy a natural disorder, not a sacred one. But in a world ruled by fear and faith, these voices were whispers against the thunder of dogma. It wouldn't be until the Enlightenment and the scientific revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries that epilepsy would begin to shed its cloak of evil. With the advent of neurology, brain mapping, and electroencephalography, the true nature of seizures became clearer. Only then did the tide finally turn. But by then, centuries of cruelty had left scars, social, psychological, and medical, that would take generations to heal. Today, when we see someone having a seizure, we understand. We know it is not possession. It is not sin. It is not a sign of moral failing or spiritual corruption. It is a neurological storm, one that can be treated with care, medication, and support. But to forget the long, dark road that brought us here would be to forget the cost of ignorance and the power of belief to both heal and harm. The story of epilepsy in medieval Europe is more than a cautionary tale. It is a brutal reminder of what happens when fear overrides reason, when superstition replaces compassion, and when society turns its back on those who need understanding the most. It is a history that trembles, not just with the seizures of its victims, but with the tremors of a civilization lost in the dark, mistaking suffering for sin and turning healing into horror. And only by remembering this history can we ensure it is never repeated. Witch hunters targeted epileptics during the Inquisition. They were feared, not understood. In a time when reason was no match for superstition, a simple seizure could mark the beginning of a nightmare. During the dark years of the Inquisition, when Europe was consumed by fear of heresy, the devil, and the arcane, those who suffered from epilepsy lived under the constant threat of persecution. It wasn't called epilepsy back then. It was called possession, witchcraft, or a pact with the devil, and for thousands that misunderstanding proved fatal. Imagine convulsing suddenly in the middle of a crowded square in 15th century Spain. Your body twists without warning, eyes roll back, words slur or vanish entirely. The people around you do not see a neurological condition. They see black magic. They see a sign from the devil himself. Some drop to their knees to pray. Others back away in horror. And a few, those with power, begin to whisper that you are a servant of darkness. These moments were enough to end lives. Under the hammer of the Inquisition, no ailment was safe from suspicion. The Inquisition, beginning formally in 1478 under Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, was meant to preserve religious orthodoxy. But in truth, it fed on fear. It was a machine that devoured difference. Any behavior outside the norm, especially when misunderstood, could be twisted into proof of heresy. Women who knew too much about herbs, midwives who failed to save a child, men who spoke out of turn, and yes, those who had seizures, were all caught in its web. Epilepsy, with its sudden, violent manifestations, was the perfect scapegoat. The Church had long held that bodily symptoms might reflect spiritual realities. Augustine and Aquinas had suggested illness could be punishment for sin. But by the time the witch hunts swept through Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, this theology was twisted further. Seizures weren't just seen as punishment. They were signs of active collaboration with Satan. In many cases, those who convulsed were accused of shape-shifting, of consorting with demons during their fits, or of flying to secret sabbats in the dead of night. Torture was used to confirm these delusions. Confessions were forced from individuals who barely remembered what happened during their seizures. The epileptic aura, those moments of confusion or sensory hallucination that precede a seizure, were often recounted under duress and interpreted as visions from hell. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, played a pivotal role. It was a manual for identifying, interrogating, and executing witches. It taught that witches were primarily women, often seduced by Satan, and could cause storms, death, infertility, and seizures. The book explicitly linked strange physical phenomena with supernatural influence. For those with epilepsy, it was a death sentence printed in ink. Records from witch trials are filled with descriptions that modern neurologists would instantly recognize: frothing at the mouth, jerking limbs, trance-like states, temporary loss of consciousness. But in those courtrooms, they were interpreted as proof of demonic possession or diabolical rituals. "She spoke in tongues," the accusers would say. "He bit his own tongue in the throes of a seizure. Surely the devil rides within him." It didn't matter that these were medical symptoms. Medicine had no voice in the chambers of faith-driven justice. Women were disproportionately accused. In many European societies, female bodies were already considered unruly, more susceptible to temptation, and less rational. A seizure in a woman was not seen through a lens of compassion, but as evidence of her fallenness. She must have lain with the devil. She must have cursed a neighbor. She must be burned. In 1590, in the town of North Berwick, Scotland, dozens were accused of witchcraft in one of the country's most notorious trials. Among them were individuals who had suffered what today would be classified as epileptic seizures. They were interrogated for hours, stripped of dignity, tortured for names, for secrets, for patterns that didn't exist. Many were executed, not for crimes, but for symptoms they could not control. Even those who survived were marked. Inquisitors often demanded repentance and public shaming. Some were branded, others were imprisoned. Many lived the rest of their lives in fear of a relapse that could again be interpreted as a return to evil. Behind this cruelty was a deep institutional failure, a refusal to understand the human body in natural terms. For centuries, epilepsy was called the sacred disease, ironically because it was thought to come from the gods. But by the time of the Inquisition, the sacred had become the damned. The divine had become the demonic. And the people who lived with this condition were trapped between two spiritual extremes, neither of which offered mercy. It wasn't until centuries later that the grip of this ignorance began to loosen. In the 17th and 18th centuries, medicine started to challenge the theological model of disease. Physicians began to write cautiously about the brain's role in epilepsy. But for countless victims of the Inquisition, this shift came too late. Today, epilepsy is recognized as a complex neurological disorder, affecting over 50 million people worldwide. It is studied, treated, and understood. But its dark history remains a reminder of what happens when science is silenced, when fear becomes doctrine, and when human suffering is used to justify cruelty. The flames that consumed those accused of witchcraft didn't just destroy lives, they destroyed trust. They delayed progress. And they remind us even now to question how society treats those who are different, those whose bodies speak in unfamiliar ways. For behind every accusation was a person, and behind every person a mind and body struggling not with demons, but with a condition still misunderstood. The Inquisition is over. But the echoes of its judgments linger. And for the victims with epilepsy who perished in its fires, the truth came centuries too late. Islamic physicians in the Golden Age tried to treat epilepsy with science. In the heart of the Islamic Golden Age, between the 8th and 13th centuries, a silent revolution stirred in the minds of scholars, one that dared to defy superstition and reach into the depths of science and reason. In a world where epilepsy was widely feared, misunderstood, and often associated with possession, divine punishment, or evil omens, a group of pioneering Islamic physicians looked beyond fear. They did not see a curse or a devil's mark. They saw a condition of the brain, an ailment that, like any other, could be studied, classified, and treated. Among them stood Avicenna, known in the Islamic world as Ibn Sina, a Persian polymath whose works would shape medicine for centuries. Born in 980 CE, Avicenna's intellect spanned medicine, philosophy, astronomy, and more. But it was in his Canon of Medicine, a text that remained the standard medical authority in Europe and the Middle East for nearly 600 years, that he addressed epilepsy not with incantations or fear, but with science. Avicenna made a remarkable distinction between different forms of epilepsy. He categorized it as a neurological disorder, centuries ahead of his time. He theorized that seizures stemmed from the brain, not from the heart or the soul. He described both generalized and partial seizures with clarity and accuracy that echoed modern classifications. His writings show a careful observation of symptoms, convulsions, unconsciousness, involuntary movements. He linked them to disturbances in the brain's function, not to spiritual invasion. In doing so, he challenged the prevailing narrative of epilepsy as divine retribution or demonic possession. But Avicenna was not alone. Other Islamic physicians across Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba contributed to this shift. Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, emphasized empirical observation and ethical care. He advocated for rational diagnoses and treatments based on the balance of bodily humors. While still influenced by Greek theories, his approach was far more grounded than the punitive exorcisms common in medieval Europe. These scholars experimented with herbal remedies, dietary changes, and even environmental factors like stress and sleep, seeking physical causes rather than supernatural ones. In their world, hospitals were thriving institutions of care and study. The famed Bimaristans of Damascus and Baghdad were not places of exile or fear, but centers of healing. Patients with epilepsy were observed, recorded, and treated, not chained, not beaten, not exorcised. Physicians documented the efficacy of valerian, rue, and other botanicals believed to calm the nervous system. They theorized about brain fluids, imbalances, and the flow of vital energies, not unlike today's neurotransmitters. Yet, while the Islamic world moved forward, Europe stood still. Christian doctrine, particularly in the early and high Middle Ages, clung to the idea that epilepsy was spiritual corruption. Sufferers were sometimes imprisoned, exorcised, or even executed, believed to be in league with the devil. The idea that a physical ailment could mimic divine punishment was heresy in many quarters. As the Islamic world studied, Europe feared. As physicians experimented, the Church condemned. What made this divergence even more striking was that much of Islamic medicine was built upon Greek foundations, Hippocrates, Galen, and others. But where Greek texts had been forgotten or forbidden in much of Christian Europe, Islamic scholars preserved, translated, and expanded them. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became a beacon of knowledge where ancient manuscripts were translated into Arabic, commented upon, and improved. Avicenna and his peers did not merely copy, they innovated. The tragedy lies in what happened next. During the later Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, when Europe began to rediscover classical knowledge, many of these Islamic contributions were quietly erased from the narrative. European scholars translated Arabic texts into Latin, but often omitted or downplayed the names of their original authors. Avicenna's canon influenced Western medicine deeply, yet his name was often stripped from the margins. His ideas were adopted, but his identity was not honored. It would not be until the 19th and 20th centuries that Western medicine fully embraced the idea that epilepsy was a neurological condition. Yet, centuries earlier, in cities that glittered under minarets and echoed with the call to prayer, men like Avicenna had already said the same, with no MRIs, no EEGs, and no modern neurology. Just observation, reason, and the courage to see what others would not. Their work reminds us that science does not belong to one civilization, one language, or one religion. The history of epilepsy is not just a medical story, it's a human story. A story of minds willing to challenge dogma, of physicians who saw suffering not as sin, but as a call to understanding, and of a world that once believed demons danced in the minds of the afflicted, only to be shown through ancient Islamic insight that the brain is not a battleground of spirits, but a frontier of science. Even today, as millions worldwide still face stigma and misunderstanding for neurological conditions, the legacy of Avicenna and his fellow Islamic physicians endures. They saw the truth long before it was accepted. They proved that compassion, inquiry, and evidence could triumph over fear. And in the shadowed halls of medieval hospitals, where the sick lay in silence, their quiet defiance became the first light of modern neurology. This was not just a medical awakening. It was a revolution of thought, and it began not in the laboratories of the West, but in the golden libraries of the East, where science was sacred and healing was holy. Would you like an accompanying 16:9 image prompt to match the narration's atmosphere? The Catholic Church claimed saints could cure epilepsy. In the echoing halls of medieval Europe, beneath stained glass windows and the heavy shadow of crucifixes, a strange and sorrowful belief spread its roots deep into Christian doctrine, that epilepsy, then known as the sacred disease, was not a condition of the body, but a mark of divine punishment or demonic affliction. And in this world where illness was sin and suffering was penance, the Catholic Church became the sole authority on healing, not through medicine, but through saints. To the faithful, epilepsy wasn't just misunderstood, it was feared. Those who suffered seizures were often isolated, whispered about, or even accused of being possessed. A child convulsing at Mass, a farmer struck to the ground by invisible forces. These weren't seen as medical emergencies. They were spiritual crises. The body became a battlefield, and the Church claimed to hold the only cure. Not in the form of doctors, but relics, holy bones, shards of robes, drops of dried blood locked in glass. These were the tools of salvation. People with epilepsy were sent on pilgrimages, long, painful journeys to distant shrines said to hold the remains or personal effects of saints like Saint Valentine, Saint John the Baptist, or Saint Vitus. Their seizures, it was believed, could be banished through proximity to sanctity. Touch the bone, kiss the reliquary, kneel at the tomb, and perhaps the demon would flee. One of the most famous was the cult of Saint Vitus, whose name would forever be linked with seizures and convulsions. Saint Vitus dance, as it became known, was a term used for neurological disorders, especially those involving tremors or uncontrolled movements. People came by the hundreds, sometimes thousands, to the places where his relics were displayed. Families wept, priests chanted, and those who convulsed in the crowd were seen not as patients, but as vessels of impurity, desperately needing the saint's mercy. And what if they were not healed? The answer was brutal in its simplicity. Their faith must not have been strong enough. The Church rarely blamed the shrine or the ritual. Instead, the sufferer bore the shame. Epilepsy, already isolating, became a kind of spiritual failure. Hope was given in one hand, but stigma was etched with the other. If a miracle didn't arrive, the only explanation was that you hadn't earned it. This wasn't healing. It was moral judgment. In many cases, those with epilepsy were forced to wear relics around their necks or carry charms blessed by clergy, not to comfort them, but to protect others. The community believed the seizures could be contagious spiritually, like demonic influence could jump from one body to another. And so the afflicted were marked with objects of holiness, not as believers, but as warnings. The Church meant to soothe, but often it segregated. Behind the miracle stories and the incense smoke was a cold reality. People with epilepsy were denied actual care. They were not examined, not treated, not understood. Their pain was not mapped, but moralized. And in a world where the Church was both doctor and judge, there was no second opinion. Yet we must ask, why did these beliefs persist? Why did families walk barefoot for weeks, climb hills with their trembling children, and kneel before silent stones? The answer is devastatingly human. When medicine fails or has yet to be born, people reach for meaning, for control, for hope. And the Church, for all its errors, gave them something to cling to. Even today, echoes remain. The language of miracle cures. The idea that illness is somehow deserved. That healing requires belief. We like to think we've moved on, but superstition often dresses itself in new robes. The truth, buried beneath centuries of ritual and fear, is that epilepsy is a complex neurological disorder, one that has haunted humanity for millennia. It isn't caused by spirits or sins. It doesn't yield to prayers alone, and those who suffer it don't need shrines. They need understanding, compassion, and care rooted in science, not shame. But still, across Europe, the shrines stand. The relics gleam. Pilgrims still kneel in hope, not just for epilepsy, but for all manner of wounds invisible to modern medicine. And maybe that's the final twist of this ancient tale, how something born from ignorance can still comfort the broken. Not because it cures them, but because it reminds them they are not alone. And in a world that once condemned them as cursed, that reminder is a small sacred miracle in itself. The term falling sickness was used to hide social discomfort. In the quiet chambers of palaces and courts, where image was everything and bloodlines were sacred, there was a secret often whispered but never named. When a noble or royal collapsed without warning, their limbs trembling, mouth frothing, and consciousness slipping into a storm of uncontrollable spasms, no one dared call it what it was. Instead, they invoked a gentler phrase, the falling sickness, a term as vague as it was strategic, a linguistic veil designed to shield reputations from the shame of a misunderstood illness. Epilepsy, with all its mystery and terror, was for centuries treated less as a medical condition and more as a spiritual blemish. In many cultures, a seizure was seen not as a symptom, but as a message, divine possession, demonic attack, or cosmic punishment. But when these convulsions afflicted the powerful, kings, queens, and aristocrats, such explanations became politically dangerous. To suggest that royalty could be touched by spirits, or worse, afflicted with madness, was unthinkable. Their bodies were considered vessels of divine right, unassailable and pure. And so the language adapted. Falling sickness was not a diagnosis, it was an evasion, a rhetorical disguise that allowed monarchs and noble families to speak of epilepsy without invoking the full horror of what it meant. It softened the truth, distanced it. The phrase implied clumsiness, faintness, anything but a terrifying neurological disruption. It made the unbearable palatable, wrapping a chaotic truth in a socially acceptable lie. The use of euphemism served more than politeness. It was a survival tactic in a world where perception dictated power. A ruler who twitched and fell during ceremony could lose not just dignity, but legitimacy. Their illness could be interpreted as a sign from the heavens, a curse, a judgment, a divine disqualification. In a time when monarchs claimed their right to rule by birth and by God, a seizure was a dangerous contradiction. One of the most well-known historical figures believed to have had epilepsy was Julius Caesar. Ancient sources describe him suffering from sudden fainting fits and convulsions. Yet in Roman tradition, such an ailment couldn't be named plainly, especially not in connection to someone who claimed divine descent. So even the whispers were carefully managed. Later, Napoleon Bonaparte was suspected of having some form of neurological disorder, perhaps epilepsy. But the public narrative never allowed space for vulnerability. The myth of power had to be maintained, and euphemism was the armor that made it possible. In the courts of medieval Europe, epilepsy became not only stigmatized, but romanticized, at least in certain circles. Some believed that seizures offered access to divine visions, spiritual awakenings. This was especially true for religious mystics, but the narrative only applied when it was useful. For royalty, anything that hinted at instability had to be buried. And so, falling sickness became a linguistic mask. It appeared in royal medical logs, in letters between monarchs, and in records of noble households as a catch-all term, deliberately vague, always unthreatening. The stigma was not confined to language alone. People with epilepsy, especially outside noble circles, were often shunned, exiled, or even accused of witchcraft. In many towns across Europe, seizures were grounds for imprisonment, or worse. Marriages were broken off, inheritances revoked. And for those in power, the risk was even more delicate. A single public seizure could incite rumors, political rebellion, or loss of authority. Euphemism then wasn't just for comfort, it was for containment. The language was a barrier between private truth and public perception. Even into the 18th and 19th centuries, the term falling sickness persisted. It appeared in medical texts, social diaries, and legal documents. It was, by then, a cultural artifact, a relic of the long-standing fear surrounding epilepsy. Only with the rise of neurology and scientific medicine did the term begin to fade, replaced by a more clinical, more honest language. But even today, the echoes remain. In many parts of the world, epilepsy still carries stigma. Patients hide their condition from employers, schools, and even family members. They fear being labeled unstable, dangerous, or broken. And so, the spirit of euphemism continues, not always in words, but in silence. The term falling sickness may sound archaic, even quaint, but its history reveals something deeply human: our discomfort with what we don't understand, our need to protect power with illusion, and our tendency to cover fear with language. It tells the story of how society has long struggled to confront illness, not only as a biological event, but as a cultural and political force. It reminds us that language is never neutral. It shapes how we see each other, and how we see ourselves. For centuries, epilepsy was hidden beneath a polite phrase, its reality denied in favor of a fiction more convenient, more comforting, more controllable. But truth, like the mind itself, cannot be contained forever. Eventually, the veil lifts, and when it does, we're left to reckon with what we were afraid to say. That reckoning begins with naming things for what they are, not falling, not cursed, just human, and worthy of care, not concealment. Epileptics were banned from marrying in some countries. In the long and often misunderstood history of epilepsy, perhaps one of the most chilling chapters is how deeply the condition was woven into laws meant to control not just the lives of individuals, but their ability to love, marry, and create families. Across centuries and civilizations, epileptics were not merely feared or pitied, they were legislated against. The belief that epilepsy was a stain on blood, a sign of corruption in the flesh, led to legal restrictions that were as cruel as they were misguided. One of the harshest expressions of this belief was the outright banning of marriage for those who suffered from seizures. In ancient Rome, where family lineage and blood purity were paramount, epilepsy was considered both a medical condition and a moral failing. Romans believed that certain illnesses revealed a deeper uncleanliness, something that could poison future generations. Epilepsy, with its dramatic physical symptoms and unpredictable nature, struck fear into a society obsessed with order and control. It was called the morbus sacer, the sacred disease, but not in a reverent way. It was a name laced with dread and fatalism. Roman law prohibited epileptics from marrying. The rationale was simple and severe. Epilepsy was viewed as hereditary, incurable, and shameful. Allowing someone with the condition to marry could pollute the bloodline of Roman citizens, weakening not only the family but, by extension, the Roman state. Marriage contracts, which were legally binding and often tied to property and power, could be annulled if epilepsy was discovered. In some cases, if an individual suffered a seizure during the wedding ceremony itself, the marriage was considered invalid, a sign from the gods that the union should not proceed. This fear didn't vanish with the fall of Rome. It lingered. For over 1,000 years, epilepsy remained wrapped in stigma and superstition, whispered about in courtrooms and cathedrals. And then, in the 19th century, an age supposedly lit by reason and science, these ancient fears returned in a new insidious form. As Europe embraced the early days of modern medicine and eugenics, new laws emerged. But instead of liberating the epileptic, they bound them tighter. In places like Germany, Switzerland, and parts of Scandinavia, legislation was passed that forbade epileptics from marrying or having children. The justification? Science, but twisted, weaponized science. Doctors and lawmakers claimed that epilepsy was a sign of genetic weakness. They believed it could be passed down like a curse, tainting future generations. As ideas of racial purity and national strength gained popularity in political circles, epilepsy became one of many undesirable traits targeted for eradication through selective breeding or forced sterilization. The notion of tainted bloodlines became codified in law, reinforced by medical boards and public health policies. In Germany, even before the rise of the Nazis, epileptics were often institutionalized and denied reproductive rights. And under Hitler's regime, the consequences became even more terrifying. Epilepsy was one of the conditions included in the infamous 1933 Law for the Prevention of Offspring with Hereditary Diseases. Thousands were sterilized against their will, stripped of bodily autonomy in the name of genetic hygiene. In these societies, epilepsy was no longer just a misunderstood illness. It was a crime against the future. Imagine the human cost of this. A young woman in 19th century Norway who dreams of marriage is denied a license because she once had a seizure as a child. A man in rural Bavaria, in love and engaged, is forcibly sterilized by the state after a doctor reports his condition. Entire generations lived with the weight of knowing their medical condition made them legally unworthy of love, companionship, or the chance to have a family. They were marked, not just by seizures, but by society's brutal decision that they were less than fully human. This wasn't confined to Europe. In the United States, epileptics were banned from marrying in several states well into the 20th century. As late as the 1950s, American laws in states like Virginia, Mississippi, and North Carolina included epilepsy alongside mental illness and criminality, as reasons to void or deny marriage. It wasn't until 1970 that the last of these laws were repealed. Throughout this legal and social persecution, those with epilepsy lived on the margins. They were discouraged from participating in the most fundamental human rituals: love, marriage, family. Their bodies became battlegrounds where medicine, morality, and law collided, and yet they persisted. Despite the stigma, despite the bans, epileptics throughout history resisted quietly. By forming relationships in secret, by challenging unjust laws, and by pushing science to finally understand their condition. Today, epilepsy is recognized for what it is: a neurological disorder, treatable, often manageable, and certainly not a moral failing. We know that while some forms have genetic links, the risk of inheritance is nowhere near what those old laws claimed. And yet, the shadow of that history lingers. The fear, the silence, the shame, these are not just relics of the past, they're reminders of how deeply ignorance can shape law and how cruel policy can become when driven by fear instead of empathy. To speak of the marriage bans imposed on epileptics is not just to recount a strange footnote of history. It is to expose the chilling reality that medical conditions have long been used to justify exclusion, control, and abuse. It is to remember that science without compassion becomes a weapon, and it is to honor those who for centuries were told they were unworthy of love, yet still found ways to love anyway. The notion that epilepsy was contagious persisted for centuries. There was a time, longer than most care to admit, when the very presence of a person having a seizure was enough to scatter a crowd in terror. Not because of the shaking or the groaning, not because of the fall, but because of a deeper, more insidious belief that epilepsy could spread, that it was contagious, that if you touched the person, breathed the same air, or even looked too long, you might become like them. This fear did not come from science. It came from centuries of superstition, folklore, and religious misinterpretation. To understand how such a belief could take root, you must go back to the ancient world, where the line between disease and curse was almost invisible. In ancient Rome, epilepsy was called the morbus sacer, the sacred disease. But sacred didn't mean holy in a good way. It meant feared. It meant otherworldly. Romans believed those who convulsed were struck by divine or infernal forces. In temples and marketplaces, it became common for people to turn their faces away, cover their mouths, or even spit on the ground if someone collapsed nearby. This wasn't just disrespect. It was ritual, a protective act. They believed that the breath of someone with epilepsy could transmit their condition, or worse, the curse behind it. This fear solidified in the Middle Ages. With the rise of Christianity came a darker spin. Epilepsy was not just sacred. It was demonic. The person foaming at the mouth wasn't seen as a sufferer of illness, but as a vessel of evil. Priests warned that proximity to such a person during a seizure could taint your soul. If you helped them, touched them, or tried to comfort them, you risked spiritual infection. Even physicians of the time, lacking the tools or understanding to observe the neurological basis of epilepsy, offered theories rooted in humors, vapors, and contagious fluids. One 14th-century medical text advised that a person witnessing a seizure should take care not to breathe deeply, nor make skin contact, lest the affliction jump like fire from coal. Families were urged to isolate afflicted children. In some towns, laws were passed barring epileptics from attending church or public festivals under the guise of preventing outbreaks. The seizures were feared not just as spectacle, but as a trigger, as if seeing it once might plant it in your blood. In medieval France and Italy, burial records show that individuals with epilepsy were sometimes buried with their mouths stuffed with cloth, their limbs bound, or their bodies sealed in stone-lined graves. Why? To prevent the curse from escaping. Some cemeteries had designated plots for those who died of unclean diseases, a term that included epilepsy alongside leprosy and plague. The logic was not medical, it was magical. People feared contamination of the spirit, the soil, the community. Even into the Renaissance, an era that praised reason and revival of classical knowledge, these beliefs endured. A common myth said that epilepsy could be passed through saliva. If someone bit their tongue during a seizure and blood came forth, it was seen as doubly dangerous. Midwives were warned not to let epileptic mothers nurse, believing their milk might carry the fits into the child. Teachers in rural schools often refused to allow epileptic children to enroll, saying their presence could set off a chain of fits in others. There are records from the 17th century in England and Germany describing so-called epileptic contagion outbreaks. In some towns, after one dramatic public seizure, usually in church or during a sermon, multiple townsfolk would begin experiencing shaking episodes. These were likely psychosomatic, driven by fear and hysteria. But at the time, they were seen as proof that epilepsy could spread like a plague of the soul. Perhaps most tragically, many individuals began to believe they truly were cursed. Imagine being a child, collapsing in front of your friends, only to wake to find them gone, terrified that your breath might have infected them. Imagine your parents pulling away, not out of cruelty, but fear that your condition might taint the rest of the family. Shame became a second sickness. Even physicians well into the 18th and 19th centuries debated whether epilepsy could be considered socially contagious. Some argued that exposure to fits might unleash latent madness in the vulnerable. Others, under the guise of medical theory, still advised keeping epileptics apart from the general population, not because they believed in literal contagion, but because fear had infected the culture. By the 1800s, scientific progress began to chip away at the myths. Pioneers like John Hewlings Jackson and William Gowers began documenting the electrical origins of seizures. They studied the brain, not the breath. They used observation and records, not holy water and fear. Hospitals began to admit people with epilepsy not as pariahs, but as patients. Slowly, the narrative shifted. But centuries of fear don't dissolve overnight. Even today, in some parts of the world, these old beliefs linger. Children with epilepsy are still hidden from view, denied schooling, or excluded from play. In some places, families still believe a seizure can jump from body to body like a curse passed through air. The belief that epilepsy was contagious was never just about health, it was about otherness. It was a way to draw a line between us and them, between what was explainable and what terrified us. The people who convulsed, who forgot, who fell without warning, they were reminders that control is fragile, that the body can betray, that the mind without warning can glitch, and that frightened us more than any disease. Today, we know the truth. Epilepsy is not contagious. It does not spread by touch or breath or gaze. It is a neurological disorder, complex, real, and as deserving of compassion as any condition. But the memory of that ancient fear still shapes how people are treated. That is why we remember. To ensure history does not repeat itself in whispers, in suspicion, in avoidance. To speak truth into silence. To touch the untouchable. To breathe beside the fallen and lift them up. Epileptic children were often locked away or killed in infancy. In the silent corners of ancient and medieval homes where candlelight flickered and superstition ruled, there were children who never had a name. Children who shook, convulsed, cried without reason. Children who bore the unexplained signs of seizures. And for many of them, life ended before it ever truly began. Throughout history, epilepsy has been feared, shunned, and misunderstood. But nowhere was this more tragically visible than in the treatment of infants and young children. Before medicine had language to describe neurological disorders, before science dared to oppose theology, children who showed signs of epilepsy were often not seen as ill. They were seen as cursed, possessed, inhuman. In ancient civilizations, such as Rome and Greece, the birth of a child with visible deformities or mysterious ailments often marked them for death. Roman law, particularly under the 12 Tables, permitted the killing of deformed or monstrous infants. Though epilepsy was not a deformity in the physical sense, its sudden and violent manifestations, convulsions, foaming at the mouth, loss of consciousness, frightened parents and communities. To witness a newborn tremble in seizure was to see something terrifying, something unnatural. It didn't inspire compassion, it invited fear. Infanticide in such cases was not considered murder. It was viewed as a grim necessity. Some believed it to be a mercy, others a duty to the gods or to community purity. In remote villages, these children were drowned, smothered, or simply abandoned. They were buried in unmarked graves, discarded in wilderness, or left to exposure, silent victims of a world that had no place for neurological difference. As Christianity spread across Europe, the Church's influence changed the narrative, but not always for the better. Epilepsy became known as the morbus demonicus, the devil's disease. Infants who suffered from seizures were said to be born under a curse or as punishment for the sins of the parents. In this era, explanations for disease came not from the body, but from the soul. A convulsing child was not just sick, they were seen as spiritually corrupted. This belief led to one of the most harrowing practices of medieval Europe: isolation. If a child survived infancy despite seizures, they were often hidden away, sometimes in cellars, sometimes in monasteries, sometimes in convents, where they were never seen again. Parents feared the shame of having a possessed child. They feared excommunication, community rejection, or the belief that their entire bloodline was cursed. Some children were sent to live out their days in complete solitude. Others were brought to churches for exorcism, an ordeal that could include physical violence, starvation, or the burning of herbs and oils that caused suffocation. The treatment often became another kind of death. Across cultures, epilepsy in children triggered dread. In early Norse society, the disease was thought to be caused by the touch of the undead. In parts of ancient India, a child with epilepsy might be associated with karmic punishment for past lives. In pre-Islamic Arabia, the jinn were blamed, supernatural beings believed to possess the young. And when a child convulsed, parents were often advised by spiritual leaders to abandon them to avoid bringing wrath upon the family. The suffering wasn't always physical. It was psychological. These children, even when spared, were often denied names, identities, or rights. In legal codes throughout medieval Europe, epileptics were sometimes barred from inheritance, marriage, or even being baptized. A child who could not be baptized, some believed, could not be saved. That belief alone led some to justify killing the child, because a life without the possibility of salvation was thought worse than death. Rare exceptions existed. In some regions of the Islamic world, as mentioned with physicians like Avicenna, epilepsy was studied rather than feared. But even then, access to that level of care was rare, especially for children in poor families or rural areas. For most of history, the diagnosis meant only one thing: exile from the human story. Centuries passed before this brutality began to subside. In Enlightenment Europe, thinkers and physicians slowly began to challenge the spiritual interpretation of epilepsy. But the scars of past centuries remained. Even in the 19th century, children with seizures were frequently institutionalized or placed in asylums. Often misdiagnosed as insane, they lived in wards alongside the mentally ill, the criminally violent, and the forgotten. Records from Victorian institutions reveal heartbreaking stories: children who never learned to speak, who never received education, who lived and died within walls they never chose. Modern medicine has since made great strides in understanding epilepsy. We now know it is a neurological condition caused by sudden bursts of electrical activity in the brain. We understand its types, its causes, its treatments. And yet, even now, the echoes of that ancient fear persist. Children with epilepsy still face stigma, misunderstanding, and isolation in some parts of the world. But the darkest chapters of history must not be forgotten, because behind every statistic is a life. A baby who trembled in the night, a mother who wept in silence, a family that carried shame instead of love. These children were not demons, they were not cursed, they were human beings, and their stories, long buried, must be unearthed and told. not as a tale of horror, but as a reminder that science and empathy must walk together, that superstition, when unchecked, destroys, and that every child, no matter how they shake, cry, or fall, deserves not fear, but understanding. They were lost before their time. We owe it to them to remember, to speak of what was done in darkness, and to ensure that no child anywhere is ever again treated as a curse simply for the way their brain was made. Victorian asylums confined people with epilepsy, alongside the insane. In the gas-lit corridors of 19th century England, beneath high iron gates and the cold stone walls of Victorian asylums, a silent war was being waged against minds that trembled and bodies that betrayed their own rhythm. This was an era of rigid moral codes and scientific misunderstanding, where suffering was catalogued not to heal, but to contain. And among the many confined under the broad and brutal label of insanity were people with epilepsy. To modernize, epilepsy is a neurological condition, misfires in the brain's electrical circuits. But in Victorian society, it was seen as something darker, a defect of character, a failure of self-control, even a contagious form of madness. Epileptics were not sent to hospitals. They were locked away in lunatic asylums. The logic was cruel but systematic. A person who suddenly convulsed in public was feared. They might fall, shout, bite their tongue, or lose control of their bladder. And because this behavior defied the rigid norms of Victorian decorum, it was seen not as illness, but as deviance, madness. And madness had only one address: the asylum. Inside these sprawling, echoing institutions, places like Bethlehem Hospital in London or the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum, epileptics were lumped together with the severely mentally ill. No distinctions were made. A man who suffered seizures was placed in the same ward as someone experiencing delusions. A child with epilepsy might be kept in a room beside a violent patient in a psychotic break. It was one-size-fits-all containment, and epilepsy was considered just another variety of lunacy. Once inside, the treatment could be dehumanizing. Patients were often tied to their beds during seizures to prevent injury, but also to make the episodes easier for staff to manage. Some were placed in isolation chambers for days. Others were subjected to early, grotesque forms of experimentation, electroconvulsive therapy, cold water immersion, or forced ingestion of substances thought to purge demonic heat from the body. The official rationale: rehabilitation. The unspoken reality: control. Asylums were overcrowded, understaffed, and increasingly used as social dumping grounds. Epileptics, especially poor or working-class individuals, were easy targets. Once labeled, they were rarely released. Even if their seizures diminished, the stigma remained. A diagnosis of epilepsy in Victorian England wasn't just medical, it was social exile. It disqualified you from marriage, employment, and in many cases, basic dignity. And yet, the science of the time was beginning to evolve. Physicians like John Hewlings Jackson, one of the few voices of progress, argued that epilepsy was not a psychiatric condition, but a neurological one. He studied seizure patterns and proposed that they were linked to abnormal discharges in the brain's cortex. His work laid the foundation for modern neurology. But in the asylum system, his ideas were largely ignored. Institutional inertia was stronger than science. It wasn't only about misunderstanding, it was about fear. Victorian society was obsessed with the illusion of control. Epilepsy shattered that. It was unpredictable. It did not conform to rules or prayer or punishment. And so, rather than confront the complexity of the human brain, institutions locked it away behind stone and stigma. The tragedy runs deeper when you consider who ended up in these places. Many were young women whose seizures were first interpreted as hysteria. Others were men misdiagnosed as violent or unstable. Some were children who, once labeled epileptic, were never seen outside asylum walls again. Medical journals from the era describe these patients coldly, referring to them as idiotic, morally degenerate, or incurables. Their humanity was erased with ink, and yet they endured. Inside these institutions, some epileptics left behind drawings, letters, or fragmented accounts, desperate attempts to explain what was happening inside them. They spoke of fear, of shame, of isolation, not just behind doors, but within their own bodies. These were not madmen. They were witnesses to the system's failure to see them as anything more than a problem to be locked away. It would take decades for the medical community to begin distinguishing epilepsy from mental illness. It would take longer still for the public to understand. Even today, echoes of this history linger in discrimination, in misunderstanding, in the quiet stigma that still clings to the word epilepsy. But we remember this dark chapter for a reason, because it reminds us how easily ignorance, when institutionalized, can become cruelty. Because it shows how the desire to appear orderly can destroy those who do not fit the mold. And because the people with epilepsy who were confined, restrained, and forgotten, they were not just victims of a flawed system. They were human beings, and their silence deserves. In Nazi Germany, people with epilepsy were sterilized or executed. In the dark corridors of Nazi ideology, where medicine was twisted into a weapon and purity became a death sentence, epilepsy was not seen as a medical condition, but as a genetic stain. It wasn't illness, it was contamination. Under Adolf Hitler's regime, people with epilepsy, alongside those with mental illness, physical disabilities, and other so-called hereditary diseases, were targeted in one of the most chilling eugenics programs in history. A campaign not of healing, but of erasure. The roots of this horror trace back to 1933, the very year Hitler rose to power. That July, the Nazi government passed the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. Behind its sterile legal language lay a monstrous truth: forced sterilization of anyone deemed genetically unfit. Doctors, once healers, were ordered to identify individuals with conditions considered hereditary, including schizophrenia, deafness, blindness, bipolar disorder, and epilepsy. By 1939, over 400,000 Germans had been forcibly sterilized. Among them, at least 5,000 people with epilepsy were subjected to irreversible procedures, without consent, without appeal, and often without even understanding why. Teenagers, young adults, even children were led into surgical rooms where their reproductive futures were quietly severed. For many, it wasn't just the physical damage, it was the branding, the inescapable mark of being labeled defective in the eyes of the state. Epilepsy had long carried a cultural stigma, seen as a curse, a sign of weakness, even a punishment. But in Nazi Germany, it was transformed into legal grounds for sterilization, isolation, and ultimately, extermination. Because for the Nazis, eugenics wasn't pseudoscience, it was policy. They believed epilepsy weakened the genetic pool of the master race. Their solution was to cut it out, literally, from the future of Germany. But the horror did not end with sterilization. It escalated. In 1939, the same year World War II erupted, Hitler authorized a secret program known as Action T4. Its purpose was simple and devastating: the systematic murder of those deemed life unworthy of life. People with severe mental or physical disabilities, including many with epilepsy, were transferred from hospitals and care homes to killing centers disguised as clinics. Gas chambers, lethal injections, starvation. These became the treatments offered under the guise of mercy. The program was named after the address of its headquarters, Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin. Patients were often told that they were being moved for better care. Families were sent forged death certificates listing natural causes. But the truth was chilling. In the span of a few years, over 70,000 people were murdered under Action T4, and thousands more died in its shadows even after the official program was suspended due to public protest. Epileptics, whose seizures were once misunderstood as divine, were now executed as undesirable. Doctors participated, nurses assisted, bureaucrats filed the papers, and society looked away. What makes this chapter of history so haunting is not just the scale of its cruelty, but the cold logic that fueled it. The language of genetics, medicine, and public health was weaponized into a doctrine of death. The very systems meant to protect the vulnerable were turned into machines of elimination. The Hippocratic Oath was rewritten into silence. Even after the fall of the Third Reich, the scars of this genocide remained buried for decades. Survivors of forced sterilization were rarely compensated. Their stories were minimized, hidden, or forgotten in the broader narrative of the Holocaust. And yet their suffering was no less real. The Nazi war on epilepsy was not an isolated aberration. It was the logical extreme of an idea that had taken root across the world, that some lives were worth more than others. Indeed, eugenics was not born in Germany. In the early 20th century, the United States, Britain, and other countries passed similar laws and carried out forced sterilizations. But in Nazi Germany, those ideas found their fullest, darkest expression. Epilepsy, a condition of the brain, became a death sentence in a state obsessed with bloodlines. Today, we live in a world that has made progress in understanding epilepsy. It is now treated as a neurological disorder, complex, diverse, but manageable. People with epilepsy live full lives. They marry, have children, work, create, thrive. And yet the history remains. A history that must be remembered not only to honor the victims, but to guard against the return of such thinking. Because the danger of dehumanization always begins quietly, in words, in policies, in euphemisms, when we forget that every mind, every life, has value beyond its genetic code. We risk repeating the atrocities once justified in the name of science and progress. The story of Nazi Germany's war on epilepsy is not just a medical tragedy. It is a moral one. It reminds us how quickly medicine can be hijacked by ideology, how easily science can be corrupted when ethics are removed from the equation, and how, even in modern times, the shadow of eugenics still lingers in the corners of discourse. Let us remember those who were sterilized, silenced, and slaughtered, not only to mourn them, but to protect the future from ever seeing epilepsy or any difference as a reason to erase a human life. Charlemagne's legal code equated epilepsy with demonic affliction. In the empire of Charlemagne, where banners of Christian conquest fluttered above blood-stained fields and Latin prayers echoed through stone cathedrals, the body was not just flesh. It was a battleground between good and evil. Every ailment, every tremor, every unexplained collapse was interpreted through divine judgment or demonic assault. And epilepsy, with its sudden and violent seizures, was among the most feared. To the legal mind of Charlemagne, ruler of the Frankish kingdom and self-declared protector of Christendom, epilepsy was not a disease. It was a sign of spiritual invasion. His empire would not treat it with compassion, but with suspicion, punishment, and ritual cleansing. Charlemagne, also known as Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great, united much of Western Europe during the 8th and early 9th centuries, forging a Christian empire built on Roman legacy and religious orthodoxy. But in the heart of this unification was a legal code, the capitularies, that reflected not reason but the terrifying theology of the time. In these decrees, illness was not separated from sin. Madness and convulsions were not categorized by the body but by the soul. And epilepsy? It was listed as a manifestation of demonic influence. Charlemagne's laws codified the idea that seizures were evidence of possession. They stated that those who suffered them could be subjected to exorcisms sanctioned by both church and state. In some cases, legal punishment followed. Epileptics could be finied, confined, or publicly shamed. If a person convulsed in church or collapsed in the presence of a noble, it was not treated as a medical emergency, but as spiritual contamination. Such people were considered inhabited by spirits, dangerous, contagious in a supernatural sense, and in need of immediate divine intervention. Imagine the terror of living under such a regime. A man walking through the village square might suddenly drop to the ground, arms and legs seizing uncontrollably, foam on his lips. Before he can recover, the crowd surrounds him, not with help, but with horror. They drag him to the church. The priest doesn't ask about symptoms or offer water. He begins the rite of exorcism. Holy water is flung, relics pressed against the forehead, prayers shouted over the convulsing form. If the man resists or cries out, it's taken as further proof of possession. If he stops moving, it's seen as the spirit retreating, or worse, hiding. These were not rare occurrences. The blending of law and religion under Charlemagne institutionalized these rituals. His empire believed that enforcing the will of God through law was part of its divine mandate. And since epileptics were believed to host evil spirits, they were both criminal and cursed. Families of the afflicted were often shamed, pressured into isolation or relentless prayer. In certain cases, property could be seized or inheritance rights revoked, all because a person suffered from what we now understand as neurological dysfunction. Worse still, these legal codes did not simply reflect cultural superstition, they reinforced it. The Church, empowered by Charlemagne's alliance, used these laws to bolster its own authority. Exorcists rose in influence, performing rituals not just in private, but as public spectacle. The afflicted were paraded as evidence of sin in the community. Their bodies, racked with seizures, became symbols of Satan's presence among the faithful. This was not healing. It was humiliation. The psychological toll was immense. People with epilepsy learned to hide their condition at all costs. A single seizure could mean arrest, spiritual condemnation, or lifelong stigma. Entire families would move villages or change names to avoid suspicion. And those who suffered alone, without witnesses or support, often interpreted their own affliction as punishment from God. The weight of spiritual guilt compounded the physical trauma. The tragedy is that Charlemagne was not an ignorant ruler. He championed education, established schools, and preserved classical texts. He sought to unify his empire under laws and learning. But even his Renaissance could not pierce the veil of superstition when it came to epilepsy. The belief that the body was a reflection of divine favor or disfavor was simply too deeply rooted. And the spectacle of exorcism, dramatic, theatrical, and reaffirming of the Church's power, was too seductive to abandon. It would take centuries to undo the damage. The idea that epilepsy was a sign of demonic affliction persisted well into the medieval period and even bled into the Renaissance. Medical texts continued to reference spirit possession long after Charlemagne's empire had fallen, and the echoes of his legal codes, where illness was a punishable offense, lingered in European thought, shaping laws and customs for generations. Only with the rise of scientific neurology in the 18th and 19th centuries did the narrative begin to shift. Hippocrates' ancient insight that epilepsy was a disease of the brain, not the gods, was rediscovered, vindicated at last. But by then, the world had spent over 1,000 years treating the afflicted not with medicine, but with fear and fury. To remember Charlemagne's legal stance on epilepsy is to confront a painful truth, that power, even when guided by faith, can turn cruelty into policy, that laws can reinforce ignorance as easily as they can dispel it, and that for the vulnerable, for those who fall and shake and do not understand why, justice built on superstition offers no refuge. Today we recognize epilepsy for what it is, a medical condition that demands understanding, treatment, and dignity. But we cannot forget the centuries when those same seizures were grounds for punishment, humiliation, and exile. Because if the law once turned a symptom into a sin, it can do so again, unless we learn and remember and speak for those who history tried to silence. Some cultures viewed seizures as prophetic visions. In a time before medical journals, before neurons and synapses, before electricity was understood to dance through the brain, there were still seizures. People convulsed, their eyes rolled back, their bodies shook. And those who watched, helpless, mystified, often afraid, had no science to lean on. So they turned to spirit, to gods, to omens. Across the ancient world, epilepsy, the mysterious condition that seized the body without warning, was interpreted not as illness, but as prophecy. And in some cultures, those who experienced seizures were marked not as cursed, but chosen. In ancient Mesopotamia, the very heart of civilization, the line between sickness and the divine was blurred. Cuneiform tablets dating back thousands of years describe people who would suddenly fall to the ground, speak in strange tongues, or return from unconsciousness with tales of strange visions. Priests interpreted these episodes as moments of spiritual possession, either by demons who needed to be expelled or by gods who wished to speak. The afflicted were brought to temples, not hospitals. They were bathed in smoke, their bodies painted with protective symbols, their mouths filled with ritual chants. The fit was not just a medical mystery, it was a moment of sacred revelation. In the tribal societies of sub-Saharan Africa, particularly among Yoruba and Zulu traditions, seizures were often linked to spirit journeys. It was believed that during a seizure, the soul left the body and entered the realm of the ancestors or gods. When the individual returned, their words were listened to with reverence, especially if they spoke in riddles, repeated old proverbs, or made predictions. In these moments, the community did not fear them. They gathered, they watched, they waited. But still, the reverence came with caution. The person was touched by the spirit world, yes, but that touch could burn. So often, they were kept apart, honored perhaps, but also isolated. In some indigenous American cultures, the phenomenon of seizures was woven into shamanistic practices. Among certain Plains tribes, individuals who experienced convulsions or sudden trances were considered visionaries. They were thought to walk between worlds, the physical and the spiritual. A seizure was a rupture in the veil of reality. What they saw during those moments mattered. If a child had a seizure near a sacred site, elders might declare them chosen. Their life would change. They might be trained as a spiritual intermediary, a person consulted during times of crisis. But the role came with weight. Such individuals were often denied normal social roles. They were set apart, marked, their personal lives sacrificed for what the tribe saw as a divine calling. Even in ancient Greece, the philosopher and physician Hippocrates, the man who would later argue that epilepsy had natural causes, acknowledged that many believed seizures were divine. In his famous treatise on the sacred disease, he opens by stating that the condition was considered a sacred affliction because it seemed to come from nowhere, to strike unpredictably, and to transform the person experiencing it. But Hippocrates pushed back. He said, "It is no more divine than other diseases." A bold statement for its time. He was trying to reclaim the body from myth, but his voice was a whisper in a world still enthralled by the sacred. Among the Celts, too, seizures were believed to offer glimpses into the other world. Druids, priests, philosophers, and seers sometimes sought altered states of consciousness to gain wisdom. When someone fell into a fit, especially if accompanied by visions or strange utterances, they were sometimes seen as vessels for omens. Their words were not dismissed. They were recorded. But once again, such reverence had limits. Many were still feared, watched, avoided when the fits became too frequent or too violent. The paradox was everywhere, to be touched by the divine, and yet treated as untouchable. In many ancient Indian texts, epilepsy is mentioned under the name apasmara, a condition associated with unconsciousness and trembling. In Hindu mythology, the dwarf demon Apasmara symbolizes ignorance and forgetfulness. He is trampled underfoot by the dancing god Shiva in his Nataraja form. The symbolism is powerful. The seizure is ignorance, spiritual blindness. And Shiva, the cosmic force of transformation, crushes it with wisdom. Yet again, a link is made between epilepsy and the spiritual realm. But it is a painful one. The person with seizures is cast as the embodiment of forgetfulness, of disruption. In all these cultures, African, Native American, Mesopotamian, Greek, Celtic, Indian, a common thread emerges. Seizures were never neutral. They were never seen as random or meaningless. They were loaded with interpretation. The person convulsing was a message, a mystery, a mouthpiece for forces unseen. But with this mystery came a cost. Many were praised in public and shunned in private. Families hid them away. Temples used their visions, then left them alone. Tribes honored them with titles, while keeping them at arm's length. To be the carrier of prophecy was to walk alone, elevated and exiled. It is a painful legacy. Because in many of these cases, what was interpreted as vision was in fact a person enduring the terrifying helplessness of a seizure. No control, no memory, just fear. And when they awoke, they were told they had spoken to gods or demons or ancestors. It shaped their identity. Sometimes it gave them purpose. Sometimes it crushed them under the weight of other people's expectations. Today, we understand epilepsy through the lens of neuroscience. We know about abnormal electrical discharges, about focal and generalized seizures, about triggers and treatments. But the echoes of the past remain. Some still believe in the spiritual connection. Some still fear what they cannot explain. And some still look at those who suffer with a mixture of awe and distance. But maybe there's something to learn from those ancient cultures, not their fear, not their myths, but their instinct to listen. To treat those with epilepsy not as broken, but as holding insight. Not to isolate them, but to ask, what do you see when the world goes dark? Public seizures led to imprisonment or beatings. Imagine collapsing to the ground in a crowded street, your body trembling beyond your control, your mind slipping into silence as strangers circle around. You wake up moments or minutes later, dazed and breathless, only to find yourself in handcuffs, bruised, bleeding, or worse, being dragged away like a criminal. Not to a hospital, not to safety, but to a jail cell, a workhouse, or an asylum. This was not a rare horror. In 18th and 19th century cities across Europe and America, public seizures weren't seen as medical emergencies. They were seen as disruptions, spectacles, or threats. And for thousands living with epilepsy, a simple walk outside could lead to violence, imprisonment, or a lifetime locked behind asylum walls. Epilepsy in this era was not understood through science or compassion. It was viewed through the cracked lens of fear, morality, and ignorance. When a person collapsed in the middle of a streetcar, a marketplace, or a town square, onlookers didn't ask if they needed help. They assumed drunkenness, insanity, or possession. Police were often the first responders, but not as saviors. They came to contain the disturbance, to restore order, and they were authorized to do so with force. First-hand accounts from London, Paris, New York, and Boston tell of epileptics being beaten by constables or civilians, restrained with ropes or locked in holding cells without medical attention. Some were kicked or trampled while unconscious. Others were tossed into the back of paddy wagons and carted off to city jails, where they might be registered not as patients, but as vagrants or lunatics. The situation was even worse for the poor. In Victorian England, poverty was often equated with moral failure. If someone from the working class suffered a seizure in public, it was assumed they were drunk or mentally unstable. They could be arrested under the Vagrancy Acts and sent to workhouses, harsh institutions meant to reform the idle poor through labor. These were not hospitals. These were factories of suffering, where epileptics were put to work under brutal conditions, often without supervision or proper care. Seizures continued, sometimes leading to fatal accidents or further beatings for faking or disrupting the labor schedule. Doctors of the time had few answers. Many still believed epilepsy was tied to moral decay, inherited madness, or demonic affliction. Some neurologists did begin to study epilepsy with clinical curiosity. But even in medical journals, epileptics were described as unstable, dangerous, or degenerate. The pseudoscience of phrenology, the idea that personality and mental illness could be read from skull shape, classified epileptics as criminal-minded. In the growing fields of psychiatry and criminal anthropology, epilepsy became a marker of deviance. The person with seizures was often lumped in with thieves, prostitutes, and the insane. The cultural fear ran so deep that even literature and theater reinforced it. Epileptic characters were villains, possessed beings, or tragic madmen. In Dostoevsky's The Idiot, Prince Mishkin, a character based on the author's own epilepsy, is treated with suspicion, pity, and confusion. In other stories, epileptic fits were used to signal doom, otherworldliness, or divine punishment. Art reflected society's view. Epilepsy was something dark, something dangerous, something that must be hidden. And so society built walls, literal and figurative. Workhouses, jails, and asylums became holding pens for those whose bodies defied control. Families who could not afford private care often had no choice but to send epileptic relatives to institutions where they might be chained to beds, subjected to primitive treatments like cold water therapy, or simply forgotten. In the United States, epileptics were frequently placed in mental institutions. Many were misdiagnosed as schizophrenic or psychotic because they hallucinated before or after seizures. Some were sterilized under early eugenics laws, deemed unfit to reproduce. And the worst part, public record rarely separated epileptics from the criminally insane. Once institutionalized, they disappeared into a bureaucratic system that offered little distinction between illness and criminality. Even children were not spared. School-age kids who had seizures in classrooms were expelled. Some were publicly ridiculed, beaten by teachers, or told they were cursed. Parents, unable to find schools that would accept them, often kept them indoors, hidden from a world that saw them not as human, but as dangerous anomalies. This climate of fear was not born from malice alone. It was rooted in the unknown. With no EEGs, no antiepileptic drugs, no scientific framework to explain seizures, people clung to fear. But ignorance is never neutral. It grows into cruelty, policy, and generational trauma. And for centuries, those with epilepsy paid the price in bruises, broken bones, lost childhoods, and lost freedom. It wasn't until the 20th century, especially after World War II, that serious strides were made. The development of medications like phenobarbital and phenytoin offered some seizure control. EEG technology allowed doctors to study brainwave patterns. Advocacy groups began to emerge. But even today, stigma lingers. People with epilepsy still face discrimination in jobs, education, and relationships. In some countries, they are still viewed with suspicion, still denied rights, still punished for what their bodies cannot control. This history is not just a record of what happened. It's a warning. A reminder that when society fails to understand a condition, it too often resorts to punishment. That fear unchecked becomes law, and that those who suffer in silence are too easily silenced altogether. So the next time you see someone collapse, shaking, their eyes rolled back, their body betraying them, pause. Remember. That moment, so terrifying to witness, was once a death sentence, once a prison term, once a lifetime of shame, and it still could be in places where knowledge has not yet replaced fear. They were not criminals, not monsters. They were human, and they deserved far better than the cages, the cuffs, and the cruelty history gave them. In some African and Asian traditions, epileptics were left in sacred forests to die or cleanse. In the deep, dense sanctuaries of certain African and Asian landscapes, where sacred groves whisper with ancestral memory, and the spirit world is believed to breathe through wind and trees, a haunting ritual took place. Those afflicted with epilepsy, seen not as ill, but as spiritually contaminated, were led into forests not for healing, but for exile. In many traditional societies, long before neurological science reached these corners of the world, epilepsy was not understood as a disorder of the brain. It was seen as a rupture in the spiritual order. A seizure wasn't just physical. It was cosmic. It was evidence that something otherworldly had broken through. And in cultures where spirits, ancestors, and curses shaped the fabric of daily life, this breach was terrifying. So what did communities do when a child collapsed with limbs jerking uncontrollably, or when a man fell speechless and convulsing under a tree? They believed the person had been touched by a spirit, by a curse, or even by a god, and such a touch was dangerous. The afflicted were often declared impure or even contagious, not in a biological sense, but in a spiritual one. The fear wasn't just for the person suffering. It was for the village, for the crops, for the harmony between the living and the invisible world. So elders, shamans, or religious authorities made the decision: the person must be removed, not punished, but isolated, purified, or left for the spirits to reclaim. And so they were taken, sometimes willingly, sometimes by force, to sacred forests. These forests weren't ordinary woods. They were revered spaces set aside for communication with gods, with the dead, with unseen forces. They were holy ground, taboo for farming or hunting. And for some cultures, they became the final refuge for epileptics. Some were tied to trees with food and water left nearby. Others were left to wander, to cry out, to fall and bleed with no one to catch them. The idea was that the spirits would either heal them or take them. If they survived and returned, it was seen as a sign. Perhaps they had been cleansed. If they died, it meant they had been claimed. In both cases, the village was protected. This practice wasn't rooted in malice. In many cases, it was the only spiritual framework people had to understand such terrifying symptoms. Seizures seemed to defy the natural order. They were sudden, dramatic, and unexplainable. And so the response, though devastating, was shaped by a logic of fear and survival. In some cultures, people with epilepsy were even considered oracles possessed by divine voices. But even then, they were treated with distance, with awe and dread, always apart, never embraced. Anthropologists have recorded these practices in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and island communities where animistic beliefs persist. In some places, these traditions have faded with modern medicine's slow arrival. In others, they remain beneath the surface, unspoken but remembered. And even where the forests are no longer used, the shame has lingered. Families sometimes hide a child's seizures. Community leaders avoid speaking the word epilepsy. And in places where modern hospitals are far away or too expensive, people still turn to the old ways, to herbalists, to ritual baths, to isolation. Not always in forests. But still alone, there is a terrible loneliness in this kind of exile. Imagine trembling in the dirt, your body no longer your own, surrounded by trees that cannot help you, watched only by the wind. Imagine knowing your village has turned its back not out of hate, but out of sacred fear. You are not seen as human in need of help. You are seen as a vessel of chaos. And yet, these stories matter not to condemn tradition, but to understand it, because epilepsy has always been more than a medical condition. It has been a cultural mirror, reflecting what a society fears most: the loss of control, the breach of order, the presence of the inexplicable. And when fear replaces knowledge, even the sacred becomes a prison. Today, across the world, millions still suffer in silence, not just from seizures, but from the weight of centuries of misunderstanding. The forests may no longer be used, but for many, the exile continues, in whispers, in stigma, in the refusal to say the word aloud. That is why these stories must be told, to honor those left in the trees, to challenge the beliefs that still bind, and to bring the afflicted not to isolation, but into the heart of care, understanding, and dignity. Because epilepsy is not a curse, it is not a spirit, it is not a reason to be left behind. Royal families hid epilepsy like a dirty secret. In the opulent courts of ancient empires and the gilded halls of royal palaces, power rested on illusion of divine favor, flawless bloodlines, and unbreakable strength. But beneath the polished surface, many of history's most revered rulers lived with a hidden burden, one considered too shameful, too unsettling to be spoken aloud. Epilepsy. The sudden collapse, the violent convulsions, the loss of control was not merely an illness. To kings and emperors, it was a threat to their image, their authority, their legacy, and so it was buried like a scandal. A royal secret, whispered in locked rooms, erased from official records. Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul and master of Rome, is one of the earliest known figures suspected of having epilepsy. Historical accounts describe him fainting during speeches, experiencing convulsions, and collapsing in public, episodes now widely believed to be seizures. Yet Roman propaganda never acknowledged this openly. Caesar was a god among men, descended from Venus herself. To admit he had a condition that seized him without warning, that shattered his composure before crowds, would have been political suicide. Instead, his symptoms were cloaked in vague phrases: sudden weakness, falling fits, or attributed to exhaustion and overwork. Caesar's genius and might were preserved, but his neurological truth was silenced. Centuries later, Peter the Great of Russia, a towering figure in every sense, led brutal military campaigns, modernized a nation, and ruled with absolute authority. But scattered reports from his physicians and courtiers describe episodes of tremors, blackouts, and erratic behavior that many now interpret as signs of epilepsy. Yet in the official Russian histories, these moments are omitted, downplayed, or masked by tales of eccentricity. For a czar who claimed divine right, even a hint of physical vulnerability could invite rebellion or questions about his legitimacy. Better to call him mad than admit a hereditary disorder. This silence wasn't unique to Caesar or Peter. Across Europe and Asia, royal families treated epilepsy not as a medical issue, but as a disgrace. It clashed with the myth of perfection that monarchies carefully curated. Royals were meant to be strong, chosen by divine forces, immune to the afflictions of commoners. A seizure was unpredictable, violent, and often witnessed by many, impossible to fully control. And so when it happened, it was swiftly rebranded as fainting, exhaustion, or even spiritual rapture. In some cases, it was simply erased. The fear wasn't just physical. It was genetic. Epilepsy was widely believed to be hereditary. If a royal heir showed signs of it, the entire dynasty's future was at risk. Marriages could be called off, alliances broken, thrones contested, and so medical records were altered or destroyed. Heirs who suffered were kept out of sight or disinherited quietly. Sometimes a royal's death was hastened, not to cure them, but to protect the family name. This conspiracy of silence extended to the doctors themselves. Royal physicians were often sworn to secrecy. Their duty wasn't just to treat the illness, but to preserve the myth of an unblemished monarch. An honest diagnosis could endanger their careers or their lives. And so the truth was buried under euphemisms like falling sickness, sacred fits, unwind, or nerve fevers, terms that blurred the reality enough to pass without scandal. Even Queen Victoria's descendants faced the stigma. One of her great-grandsons, Prince John, suffered from epilepsy and was quietly removed from public view. He lived in seclusion until his early death, his existence nearly erased from royal biographies until recently. In his case, epilepsy was compounded by autism, another condition that monarchies of the time refused to acknowledge. His story was not one of treatment, but disappearance. This systematic suppression speaks volumes about how power and perception are intertwined. To rule, a monarch had to appear invincible. And epilepsy, visible, uncontrollable, and misunderstood, was the ultimate vulnerability. It represented chaos in a world obsessed with order. So it was hidden, not healed. But this secrecy came at a cost. By refusing to confront epilepsy openly, royal families perpetuated the stigma. Their silence echoed down the social ladder. If kings and emperors couldn't be seen with epilepsy, what did that mean for commoners who lived with it every day? Shame trickled downward, stigma calcified, and treatment for centuries lagged behind. It wasn't until the rise of modern neurology in the 19th and 20th centuries that epilepsy began to be seen through a scientific lens. But even then, the legacy of royal secrecy haunted the diagnosis. Families concealed it. Patients were institutionalized. Myths persisted. And those myths were born not just in peasant villages, but in palaces. Today, we strive to normalize epilepsy. Awareness campaigns, medical advancements, and advocacy have helped millions live openly with the condition. Yet the shadow of history remains. We still wrestle with the idea that some illnesses reflect weakness, that some truths are too messy to be accepted. And we must remember, many of history's most powerful people lived with this so-called flaw. Julius Caesar reshaped Rome. Peter the Great dragged Russia into the modern era. Queen Victoria's lineage still sits on thrones. And all of them, in one way or another, were touched by epilepsy, whether it was hidden in records, buried in euphemisms, or locked behind palace doors. So perhaps it's time to rewrite that history, not by covering it up, but by acknowledging it, not by pretending power requires perfection, but by realizing that even the greatest figures in history lived with imperfection and led nations anyway. That is not a weakness, that is resilience, that is truth. Christian pilgrimages for healing seizures. Sometimes turned deadly in medieval Christendom, illness was rarely just a matter of the body, it was a matter of the soul. Every disease, especially those that defied explanation, was viewed as a sign from God, a punishment for sin, or a trial of faith. And among these, epilepsy stood apart as something not only feared, but deeply misunderstood. Seizures, with their sudden violence and eerie unpredictability, were seen as a curse, a spiritual affliction rather than a medical one, and so, instead of physicians, many epileptics were sent to the feet of saints, dragged across unforgiving terrain on pilgrimages meant not for healing, but for spiritual atonement. It was believed that saints had the power to heal, to intercede with God on behalf of the suffering. Their tombs, relics, and shrines became destinations for those seeking divine cures. Families of epileptics, desperate and devout, often took them on arduous journeys to these sacred places, believing that proximity to holy remains could drive out the evil they thought inhabited their loved ones. But these journeys were not gentle acts of care. They were often grueling, punishing ordeals. The sick were hauled across mountains, forests, and marshlands. Many were poor, lacking provisions or shelter, walking barefoot over jagged stone paths in rain and snow. There were no medical stops, no emergency care, no understanding of the actual needs of an epileptic. The sick were often seen as vessels for demons, not people in need of rest. When they fell or seized along the way, it was taken as further evidence of spiritual corruption, proof that the devil was resisting the sacred pilgrimage. One of the most famous destinations was the tomb of St. Valentine, not the romantic icon, but a bishop whose relics were believed to cure epilepsy. In fact, for centuries, epilepsy was even referred to in parts of Europe as St. Valentine's illness. Other popular destinations included the tomb of St. Vitus in Prague and the holy wells of St. Winfried in Wales. At these places, epileptics were made to pray, fast, drink sanctified water, or bathe in icy springs in hopes of purging the unclean spirit. Some were held down, screamed at, or struck during seizures in ritualistic attempts to drive out the devil. These were not acts of healing. They were desperate acts of spiritual violence. The journey itself often became the most dangerous trial. Many died along the road, not from their illness, but from exhaustion, dehydration, infection, or neglect. Pilgrims who became too much of a burden were sometimes abandoned by companions. Their bodies were left by the roadside or hastily buried in unmarked graves. In some tragic cases, children with epilepsy were taken on pilgrimages only to never return, sacrificed to a system that confused devotion with cruelty. And those who survived the journey often came home no better than they left, some worse. Without any actual medical treatment, epileptics returned to lives of stigma and isolation. The pilgrimage might be remembered as a noble attempt, but for the sick themselves, it often reinforced their status as cursed, broken, and spiritually toxic. Behind these brutal treks was a theology that merged superstition with devotion. The Church taught that suffering could sanctify the soul, that physical affliction was a path to spiritual redemption. In this framework, to endure pain, especially in the service of a holy pilgrimage, was to prove one's worthiness before God. But epilepsy didn't conform to neat narratives. It didn't go away with prayer. It returned again and again as if mocking the rituals meant to drive it out. And so the pilgrimages became more extreme, the expectations heavier, the consequences deadlier. Not all clergy supported these brutal practices. Some monastic orders attempted to care for the epileptic with compassion, offering food, rest, and prayer in moderation. But such mercy was rare and often drowned out by the spectacle of miracle-seeking crowds. The more dramatic the affliction, the more powerful the miracle was perceived to be. Seizures were turned into public performances, moments when the crowd could witness the devil being confronted. If the epileptic thrashed and screamed, it confirmed the presence of evil. If they quieted, it was a sign of victory. Either way, the truth of their suffering was lost in the theater of faith. We look back on this now with horror. We wonder how people could so easily confuse neurological illness with moral corruption. But we must also remember the desperation that drove these actions, the need to find meaning in pain, the hope that somewhere, somehow, a sacred place could bring relief. It is the same hope that drives people today to the edge of science, to unproven cures, to ritual when reason seems to fail. The pilgrimages for epileptics are not just a tale of misplaced faith. They are a story about what happens when society turns away from science and instead leans wholly on superstition. They are a story about how love, when wrapped in fear and ignorance, can lead to abandonment. And they are a story about the endurance of those who suffered silently, dragged across continents in search of salvation they never truly needed. Today, we know the truth. Epilepsy is not a demonic curse, not a test of holiness, not a mark of the devil. It is a neurological disorder, treatable and manageable with compassion, science, and support. But history reminds us that even the purest intentions, like a pilgrimage made for love, can become deadly when guided by false beliefs. And so we honor those who walk those roads not for their cure, but as martyrs of misunderstanding carried by hope into the arms of suffering. The medical misuse of chains, restraints, and cold baths. The body convulses, limbs thrash, foam gathers at the lips, and instead of comfort, a cold iron chain is fastened tight. Instead of understanding, there is a bucket of freezing water, a gag, a belt, a cage. There was a time, not so long ago, when doctors and so-called healers didn't treat epilepsy with care. They punished it. Because before neurology, there was cruelty. Before science, there was superstition dressed as therapy. And those with epilepsy bore the weight of this ignorance, literally. From the Middle Ages into the 19th century, medical institutions across Europe and America viewed seizures not just as frightening, but as disruptions that had to be controlled at all costs. Control meant suppression, and suppression meant pain. In many early hospitals and asylums, chains were standard. Heavy iron restraints were bolted to walls and bed frames. The idea was simple. If a person seizes violently, bind them. Limit the motion. Reduce the chaos. But this wasn't about safety. It was about silence. The clanging, the writhing, the threat of a spectacle. It embarrassed the institution, frightened other patients, and reminded the staff of how little they understood. So instead of asking why the seizures occurred, they asked how to stop them from being seen. Some patients were shackled for hours, some for days. Their muscles deteriorated, their skin bruised and broke. The psychological damage was even worse. Epilepsy wasn't just treated like a disease, it was punished like a crime. Then came the cold. Ice baths were another common treatment for epileptics throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Doctors believed that extreme cold would shock the nervous system into obedience. A person would be dragged, sometimes still semi-conscious after a seizure, and submerged in frigid water. Not briefly, not gently, but with force, and for prolonged periods. In 1810, in London's Bethlem Royal Hospital, more famously known as Bedlam, records show patients being dipped in cold baths up to 15 times a week, not to soothe them, but to terrorize the body into submission. Some physicians wrote that the violent shivering following an ice bath showed that the treatment was taking effect. Others praised vomiting and diarrhea as signs that evil humors were being purged from the body. Misery was mistaken for medicine. Induced vomiting was another practice, rooted in ancient and medieval beliefs that epilepsy was caused by bile, demons, or an imbalance of the body's four humors. Patients were force-fed concoctions of tobacco juice, mustard powder, salt water, or copper sulfate, substances meant to purge the system. The violent retching was supposed to cleanse the spirit. In reality, it weakened already vulnerable bodies and left lasting internal damage. One French physician in the early 1800s described restraining an epileptic boy, inserting a feather down his throat to stimulate vomiting, then immersing him in freezing water as he choked. The boy didn't recover from his seizures, but he stopped crying, which the doctor noted as progress. Progress, that was the word they used, but it wasn't progress, it was torture under a white coat. Even into the 20th century, echoes of these practices lingered. Straps, leather cuffs, and padded rooms were used in psychiatric facilities not to treat epilepsy itself, but to contain its visibility, to erase it from polite society, to hide the uncontrollable. And while it's tempting to think this was all ancient history, stories of abuse persisted into the 1970s. In some institutions, especially underfunded or rural ones, epileptic children were still restrained during seizures, sometimes face down, sometimes isolated for hours after an episode, as if their condition were contagious or shameful. The logic was always the same: control the body. Ignore the brain. Only in the last century did science begin to replace punishment with precision. The advent of electroencephalography in the 1920s allowed doctors to see the brain's electrical storms for the first time. Epilepsy moved from the realm of demons and discipline to data and diagnosis. Medications were developed. Neurology blossomed. Patients were finally seen not as problems to be silenced, but people to be helped. But the scars remained. The psychological damage of those centuries of being shackled, drowned, gagged, and humiliated didn't vanish with new treatments. Survivors carried the trauma, communities carried the shame, and families for generations remained silent about the word epilepsy. Because how do you talk about something that once got you chained to a wall? Even today, the fear of judgment, misunderstanding, and isolation persists, not from doctors but from society, from employers, from classrooms, from neighbors who still, deep down, hold on to myths and fears older than they know, but history teaches us. And this chapter, brutal as it is, demands remembrance. To honor those who suffered in silence. To remember that treatment is not always healing. That medicine without empathy can become its own kind of madness. Chains, baths, gags, vomit. These were not cures. They were screams for understanding in a world that refused to listen. We listen now. We learn. Because the body that convulses deserves care, not correction. And the mind behind it deserves dignity, not restraint. Scientific recognition only emerged in the 19th century, after 2,000 years of stigma. For nearly 2,000 years, epilepsy was a curse with many names. The sacred disease, the devil's touch, the madness of the gods. It was whispered about in temples, feared in the streets, and punished behind the locked doors of asylums. Those who suffered from it were cast as possessed, criminal, weak, or contagious, haunted not just by seizures, but by the suffocating weight of society's misunderstanding. But then, in the waning light of the 19th century, the silence began to crack. In Paris, in the echoing halls of the Salpêtrière Hospital, a place once filled with chained women and forgotten lunatics, a physician was watching, observing, mapping. The man's name was Jean-Martin Charcot, and he would become one of the first to force the medical world to look at epilepsy not as a spiritual affliction, but as a neurological event, one that could be studied, categorized, and understood. Charcot, often called the father of modern neurology, didn't begin with epilepsy. He studied hysteria, multiple sclerosis, and neurological disorders that had no visible wounds. But he had one trait that separated him from generations of physicians before him. He watched, with patience, with rigor. He refused to accept the old ideas, possession, punishment, degeneracy, as explanations for why a body might suddenly collapse and convulse without warning. At the Salpêtrière, Charcot had access to thousands of patients, mostly women, who had been institutionalized for conditions ranging from trauma to epilepsy to misunderstood psychiatric illnesses. He studied them relentlessly, and in doing so, he did something revolutionary. He began to classify seizure types. He distinguished between what he called grand mal seizures, full-body convulsions with loss of consciousness, and petit mal seizures, brief, often unnoticed lapses of awareness. These terms, while now outdated, laid the groundwork for modern epileptic taxonomy. Charcot argued, controversially for his time, that epilepsy was a disease of the brain, a physiological disorder, not a moral failing. He used the tools available to him, detailed observation, patient histories, and early medical illustration, to construct a scientific framework around the condition. And perhaps most critically, he published. His lectures, his diagrams, and his case studies spread through Europe like a quiet wildfire. For the first time in centuries, doctors across the continent began to reconsider epilepsy not as a crime or a curse, but as something that could be diagnosed and possibly treated. But it was not an easy shift. Charcot faced opposition, not only from religious authorities who saw epilepsy as divine, but also from fellow physicians entrenched in centuries-old theories. There were still those who believed in demonic influence, in hereditary corruption, in hysteria as a diagnosis that explained everything and nothing at once. Women with epilepsy were still being committed to asylums under the label of insanity. Men were still being arrested for seizures in public. Children were still being hidden from society. What made Charcot's work so transformative wasn't just his scientific insight. It was the way he forced the world to see these patients as human. In his famous Tuesday lectures, open to the public and packed with students, doctors, and curious citizens, Charcot would bring patients before the crowd, not to shame them, but to explain them. With compassion and clarity, he would describe what was happening in the brain, what the body was trying to communicate, what treatment might look like in the future. These lectures weren't perfect. Modern ethics would never allow what was then considered normal, patients on display for education. But in an age when epileptics were feared, beaten, and institutionalized, Charcot's efforts to speak publicly, rationally, and scientifically about their condition was nothing short of revolutionary. From his teachings would emerge a generation of neurologists, most notably Sigmund Freud, who studied under him before founding psychoanalysis, and Joseph Babinski, who continued the neurological classification of disorders. The ripples of Charcot's work reached into the 20th century, influencing the development of electroencephalograms, EEGs, seizure medications, and the very concept of neurological specialties. But perhaps the most important legacy was this: he helped break the spell. For 2,000 years, epilepsy had been cloaked in fear. In the temples of Babylon, it was treated with incantations. In medieval Europe, it was exorcised with holy water and chains. In Victorian streets, it was punished with imprisonment and isolation. But in the tiled halls of a Paris hospital, a man with a notebook and an unshakable curiosity chose to look deeper. Charcot didn't cure epilepsy, but he named it. He mapped it. He gave it a home in medicine, not myth. Even now, the echoes of that stigma remain. In many cultures, epilepsy is still misunderstood. People with seizures face barriers to employment, education, and social acceptance. But thanks to Charcot and the wave of neurologists who followed him, the tide began to turn. Science finally stepped into a space long ruled by superstition. The brain, once a black box of divine mystery, began to yield its secrets. And the people who had been punished for their seizures, beaten, imprisoned, erased, were finally seen as patients, as humans, as people deserving not of fear, but of care. It took 2,000 years to cross that line, and it began with the quiet scratch of a pen, the hum of gas lamps over hospital beds, and a physician who chose to observe what others had only judged. That choice rewrote history.